It's great to be back here in India, where I have visited many times before and where I'm pleased to have so many friends. And to have visited TERI before, this great institution, as Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, and now as President of the Asia Society in New York. It reminds me that Asia, this wonderfully diverse continent, home to so many of the high civilizations of our world, now has this great global responsibility bearing down on all of us in this great continent and around it, because we represent now more than half the world's population. We increasingly represent something approaching half the world's gross domestic product. As a consequence, our responsibilities to the planet are great indeed. There's always a danger in conferences like this that we preach to the converted. I've been to a few meetings like that over the years. It's a bit like singing hymns from the same song sheet. My view on these things is very simple. The IPCC has spoken. The science is clear. That is, climate change is caused by anthropogenic activity, that if we allow temperature increases to go beyond 2 degrees centigrade, then we run the risk of irreversible climate change, and therefore global political leaders have a fiduciary duty to the planet and to the peoples of the planet and to the life forms of the planet to act to prevent that from occurring. We can complicate things too much. That's it. That's as simple as the message as to why we need to act must be. I often think that God, whoever she or he might be, must be puzzled looking down on this small blue ball called planet Earth and asking this question as to why the people of this small blue ball called planet Earth would wish to willingly suffocate themselves into extinction or fry themselves into extinction over time. We should be smarter than that. So I don't intend to preach to the converted. What I'd like to do instead is to provide 3 observations, which I would describe as lessons from Copenhagen for Paris. Like many in this room, I am a survivor of Copenhagen. Many of us still bear the scar tissue of that engagement. Some of us bore particularly deep political scar tissue from that engagement. But the bottom line is this: we are people who should learn from our international and national experiences. So I offer 3 observations. Number 1, when we look at one of the reasons that Copenhagen did not deliver the results that we needed, the causes were patently political. But let us look at the contrast points. Back then at Copenhagen, preparation was probably insufficient for that conference. For Paris, the preparation is more than sufficient. Number 2, in Copenhagen, we had an exclusion, effectively, of civil society. Our friends in France, led by Laurent Fabius, the French Foreign Minister, has learned from that, and civil society is included in our deliberations leading to Paris, and will be so at Paris itself. Number 3, back in the days of Copenhagen, the business community voice was at best divided and, frankly, often unhelpful. 5 years later, that has changed, and I pay tribute to business leaders who are with us today for being agents of that change. Number 4, back then we still had a binary debate between climate change action and economic development. 5 years later, the binary of that has frankly, basically, being resolved, as action on climate change is now seen as integral to sustainable development and sustainable economic growth. These are big changes. But the biggest change of all, and why I emphasize these political factors, lies here in this room and in this city. Back at Copenhagen, India and China were effectively opposed to a global agreement. Now that is no longer the case. I would thank our Chinese friends for that. I would particularly here in Delhi like to thank our Indian friends for that. And I acknowledge publicly the leadership of Prime Minister Modi and his ministerial team for indicating publicly that they are behind the delivery of a global agreement by the time we reach Paris. So my first lesson from Copenhagen is politics. This time, the political factors are, I believe, working in our direction. That was not the case 5 years ago. Secondly, finance. And I emphasise here what Mary Robinson has had to say most cogently in this gathering here this morning. In Copenhagen, we had no effective preparation for the financial outcomes necessary. And as a consequence, the debates we then had on the Green Development Fund, as it was then discussed, were at best ill-considered, ill-prepared, and in the view of the developing world, inadequate. 5 years later, and here is my warning, is that the debate on finance still remains unresolved. And we collectively are deluding ourselves if we think we can deliver a robust outcome in Paris in the absence of resolving finance for climate change, at least by the middle of the year before Paris. And here is Mary Robinson's key point, and I emphasise it again. Finance for climate change action must be seen as, integrated as, and delivered as finance for sustainable development. This is one conceptual whole. It is not a separate activity. And two, I would emphasise this, that if you look carefully at global finance, public finance through ODA is inadequate. It is shrinking at present. Secondly, you look at the available public finance available through the multilateral development banks. It too is not nearly adequate to the task. And thirdly, therefore, we must harness not just additional ODA, we must not just harness additional finance from the MDGs, but we must also harness new financial vehicles from the global financial community as well, which means that the projects in which we are engaged must be of sufficient financial merit to warrant the investment of private capital. After all, as Felipe Calderon has just reminded us, so much of the action on climate change lies in action effectively on investment in new infrastructure. And therefore, we must consider it as an object of both public and private finance combined with public finance providing the leverage necessary or the risk mitigation necessary for delivering larger quantums of private finance. My third and last point. Number one, politics now working against us. Two, finance unresolved. Must be resolved by mid-year, otherwise we run a real risk of things running right off the rails in the second half of the year. And thirdly, a comment about the future. Back in Copenhagen, we went to that meeting with the international community expecting that we would deliver a binding global agreement. That was the expectation. We did not deliver that. One of the compromises that was delivered both in Copenhagen and subsequently confirmed at Cancun through the leadership of Felipe Calderon was this. It was an Australian proposal for individual national declarations of action. And that's what we did. And it was intended to be a temporary exercise until such time as a binding global agreement came into being. But here is the problem. 5 years later, these individual national declarations of action have become the norm, rather than a binding global agreement on us all towards a particular endpoint. As a consequence, here is the lesson from Copenhagen for the future. If we're going to proceed on the basis of individual national action declarations as the activating mechanism for what we agree on in Paris, we therefore must build into the Paris Agreement a mandatory regular review process both of our respective national commitments and of our delivery against those commitments against the global targets we set for ourselves. Other than that, we produce a piece of paper flapping in the wind. Other than that, we run the real risk of creating some sort of Potemkin village on climate change. So to conclude, I congratulate my co-panelists on their core presentations this morning, and the stark reminder from those representing small island developing states such as the Maldives and such as Timor-Leste, and the 42 to 46 states in the United Nations family for whom this is often an existential question. I'd also congratulate the French government for their excellent preparations to date. But I conclude with the government of India, our hosts here today, and simply say what a delight it is for me, as a former Prime Minister of Australia, to hear Indian government ministers stand up here today and speak in favour of a global agreement at Paris. Perhaps when I look at India and Australia, we often celebrate the fact that we are united by 3 big C's: a common language, the Commonwealth, and our common passion for a game called cricket, in which we have had our ups and downs over the years. Australia and India, that is. And I won't comment, my Indian friends, on recent developments.
Well, we're not limiting it, that's the point.
But I could say this. Let's add a 4th C, common action on climate change.
It'd be very good if you...
And unlike cricket, where it's up and down, and it's been a bit like that over the last 5 years in terms of concerted international action on climate change, rather than 2 teams playing against each other, the world needs to unite as a single team to deliver a win for the planet and its peoples. Thank you.